From London, this is the Orwellians podcast. I'm Roland Elliott Brown. My guest today is Sean Wiswesser. Sean has worked for 28 years as a national security professional with intelligence, foreign service, and defense experience, including as a senior operations officer with the CIA. He's the author of Tradecraft, Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence, and Putin's Secret War. Sean, welcome.
Thank you, Roland. Good to be with you and your listeners. I appreciate it. Thanks.
I named this podcast after a journalist and essayist who was way ahead of the curve in debunking what he called the Russian myth, that is, the reach of Stalin's propaganda in the 1930s, 1940s. A lot has changed since Orwell's day, not least the establishment of the CIA in 1947, which was just a couple of years before Orwell's death. As far as I know, Orwell never wrote about the CIA. Maybe a good place to start would be to talk about the differences between how a journalist and an intelligence officer gather and present information. What do you think are the key differences?
Yeah, sure. Roland, we talked about this. I was intrigued by your podcast because I see a lot of Orwellian parallels to Putin's Russia today, of course, and we can talk about that more later, but he believes in elitist society where the KGB veterans, the hardliners of the former Soviet Union, he believes they had a right to call the shots. Everybody was equal, but some were much more equal than others, and Putin was a part of that, Orwellian culture, and he furthers that idea today in Russia. Of course, the FSB are the elite, the Siloviki, the strongmen that rule with him. So yeah, but for other parallels, like you said, talking about journalists versus intelligence officers, I think there's a lot of really, really big differences. I think that a lot of journalists may make the mistake of thinking, oh, my work's kind of intelligence related. At least in CIA, we make a really fundamental we draw fundamental lines. It's against U.S. law, by the way, for CIA to use journalists. I know that our Russian adversaries and Chinese and others will certainly do it, and we know CIA uses journalists. Well, we don't. It's against U.S. law. We're not going to take a chance of violating U.S. law, and we do that to try to protect journalists like, Evan Gershkovich, who was wrongly arrested in Russia on totally trumped up charges. So I think the biggest fundamental difference, though, Roland, is that for intelligence officers, if there's not secrets involved, so for CIA, if it's not classified information, if it's not a government secret, then we're not in that business. We don't do corporate espionage. The Russians do, by the way. The Chinese certainly do. They'll spy in order to get secrets for their companies, and then they'll often sell them to their companies in the corrupt kleptocracy that is the Russian government. And they do that all the time. We're prohibited by law as well. We don't do corporate espionage. There are some NATO governments who do. I'm not going to say which ones, but so for us, if there's not access to to actual government classified secrets, then CIA is not in that business. So we say, and I was an instructor of this tradecraft I talk about in my book, teaching young CIA officers, we say it's all about the access. If there's not access to classified secrets, then you don't belong in contact with that person. Move on to another target that's more viable, that it can help get the critical information that U.S. policymakers need. And so, whereas, of course, journalists cultivate a wide variety of sources, Roland, and then there's, of course, the motivations that we use to do our work. People talk about in the intelligence profession, mice. I mentioned in my book, money, ideology, compromise, ego. Well, for CIA, we certainly believe in ideology. We think our message is important. A lot of spies, like those hero spies I relate in my research and my work, hero spies that did tremendous damage to the former Soviet Union and do to Russia today, they're motivated by wanting to give a better life to their families. I don't think journalists have to think about that at all, to be honest. The better journalists do worry about their sources and care about them. There's other journalists that are less scrupulous and they don't give a damn. They're just going to get the information and then the source be damned. So those are some of the differences. I think there's a lot.
Yeah, I guess it's partly to do with the direction of flow as well. So if a journalist finds something out, it's going public. Chances are, unless there's an ethical conflict, whereas intelligence officers have a classification process, and they're sending information up the chain of command. Ultimately, the most relevant, I presume, ends up in the president's daily brief.
We hope so, right? We hope so. So it's been in the open source that different presidents over the years care more or sometimes care less about the president's daily brief, but I believe CIA provides unique service to our president. Certainly in the course of my career, I saw the value that we provide and provided and do provide. So hopefully presidents continue to believe in that. But yeah, it varies. Different presidents care more or less about intelligence.
How does who is consuming the intelligence? In other words, who the leader is, disposition, politics, all that. How does that influence what's presented to them, if at all?
Well, I think obviously the most important kind of consideration is a president's background, and I'm not a policy person, as you know, Roland, my book's apolitical, so I should state my views are mine alone. Don't represent CIA nor any other US government agency. But just as an historian, I studied history, so you look at a former president like George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush president. He was a former director of CIA, and he really valued CIA. He understood the intelligence process. When he was an ambassador to the UN, he understood the need for good intelligence and how that can affect policy in a positive way, to know what's going on. And so he was an avid consumer of intelligence. The record shows that he believed in the PDB, believed in meeting director CIA,
PDB,
and
what's that?
the Presidential
Oh,
Daily
right,
Brief. Yeah,
right.
you mentioned earlier. But then there's been other presidents since then. Reportedly, according to open sources, history. Clinton was not as avid a consumer of intelligence. Very smart, former Rhodes Scholar. He wasn't the only very, very smart president we've had recently. There's been others, but sometimes they feel like, well, I don't need to know, the intelligence. I already kind of know what I want to do. So I think that feeds into the process, and that's probably the extent of my knowledge. I was never a policy guy, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. I noticed, okay, well, let's go back to the beginning of your experiences in Russia. You mentioned in the book that before your CIA career began, you were in Rostov-on-Don in
Yeah.
1994.
Yeah.
You also traveled from Rostov to Donbass in the 90s.
Yeah.
Rostov at that time, from what I've read, was known for organized crime,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
of course, it was the main staging area for the First Chechen War, Southern Caucasus Military District, I
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah, that's
What
right.
a time to be there! What was that like?
Yeah, it was exciting. So I didn't really pick Rostov. Rostov picked me and us as a group of students. My university, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, we had an exchange program already existing with Rostov State University, and they did away with it, to be honest, Roland, to one of your points, because of corruption. I had a good experience there. I had great professors, but there was a corrupt rector of the exchange program in Rostov. He was lining his pockets. So that exchange program didn't last very long, but it was in place for me and about 10 other students that I studied with on exchange, and they had it going for a few years. I had a good experience in Rostov. There was a saying, and there is a saying in Russian. Russians say Rostov Papa, Odessa Mama, in terms of organized crime. Excuse me, that Rostov was sort of father of organized crime. Odessa was the mama of organized crime. And so at that time, that was the big sort of rumor. We were always careful as students. I think a lot of our Russian friends helped watch out for us. So I felt blessed that despite all of my travels in Russia, and I traveled a lot, over the course of 2 years, I was in Russia many times for my final 2 years in college, traveled back there, did research on World War II, did an internship with the State Department at an embassy in the former Soviet Union. And so I traveled over Russian trains thousands and thousands of miles, middle of the night, dead of the night, into some really remote areas, including the Donbass, some really, at the time, very impoverished areas. But ultimately, I always felt safe that good Russians and good Ukrainians and others, Belarusians, always tried to watch out for us as a foreigner. They had a lot of great hospitality. You notice in my book, Roland, I make a point, we're not at war with the Russian people. We're in an undeclared war that Putin and his security services declared on the West a long time ago, decades ago. And they've been engaging in it ever since, and only heightening that hybrid war. But I love the Russian people. My wife's part Russian. That blood flows in my son's veins. She's also part Lithuanian and Ukrainian. And so they're very rich people with a great culture, but they're just doomed, unfortunately, right now to have very poor government, poor leaders, corrupt leaders, and a corrupt kleptocracy running Russia.
You've got an epigraph from Lermontov. Does
Yeah,
that reflect
yeah,
an interest in the
yeah.
Caucasus?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, of course. So Lermontov, Geroi Нашего времени, and hero of our time. I read 19th century Russian literature. That's what I studied when I was in Rostov. We spent a big part of our study program was studying literature, and had very rich, gifted professors at Rostov State University. Still remember many of them vividly. I won't say their names because I don't need the FSB going and harassing them. Hopefully they're still in good health, and I wish them well. But yeah, so I also mentioned in the book, as you know, Roland, I try to infuse a lot of Russian culture and their history and into the book. Russians have a lot of indifference with regards to their intelligence tradecraft. And that's where I quote Lermontov, and I talk about, Pechorin, the character from Hero of Our Time. He's known as a hero to Russians because he's indifferent, because he doesn't give a damn. And so Russians like that. It's at times they like not giving a damn and seeming indifferent. And that breeds through their intelligence work, some of those failures that I highlight in my book, their incompetence, corruption at times, and certainly indifference. So yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. I think you can't study an adversary without understanding, as Russians say, чем дышит человек, how does a person breathe? Meaning how do they think? Not just what they say, but their mindset. And that always helped me throughout my career, as I understood a lot of their mindset. Couldn't understand it all. There's also that saying in Russian, Россию умом не понять. I think it's from Pushkin or one of the other great writers. You can't understand Russia with your mind, Только можно верить в ее, as they say. You can only believe in her, as the Russians say.
Mm-hmm. What about the Chechen War at that time?
Yeah, it was a part of my experience there. The Chechen War kicked off when I was studying there. Remember vividly watching Russian TV, the news stories. A lot of Russians were cheering the war. A lot of Russians thought that they were tired of the banditry sort of happening from Chechnya and the larger Caucasus. But then there was great surprise, of course, as the war continued to progress. It wasn't going Russia's way, and some of these major offensives that didn't work out, or the seizure. I remember one of them was around 95 or 96. The Bazayev, one of the Chechen leaders, Dagestani leaders, he seized a major Ministry of Interior building in Grozny, to the great horror and embarrassment of the Russian military. They ended up having to negotiate with him because Bazayev had surrounded and had cordoned off this Ministry of Interior barracks and, a lot of troops. So that led to a period of semi-independence, as you know, in Chechnya. And then, of course, Putin ruthlessly cracked down on that with the bombings in Moscow, the apartment bombings. And then there's a lot of speculation whether or not the FSB had a role in that or not. I don't like to speculate without hard evidence, but I think it's certainly possible. There was a really good BBC series done. I commend it to all of your listeners.
I heard it, yeah.
This very year, yeah. Yeah, Putin got a pass on that whole thing, right? It wasn't investigated very well. It wasn't really researched very well. Other things then were going on in the U.S. We had 9/11. It was just kind of forgotten and not heavily investigated. But there's parts of that story that desperately need more investigating.
Yeah. Let's jump ahead to your book. So the title of your book begins with the word tradecraft. You also mentioned that you taught advanced courses on tradecraft for what you call denied areas. The book is also primarily an expose of Russian tradecraft. Tell us the definitions of tradecraft, denied areas, and then tell us what characterizes Russian tradecraft.
Yeah, so tradecraft from an intelligence standpoint is how we do our profession, how we carry out espionage. But also in a larger sense, as I touched on in the book, the book is 10 chapters, as you know, Roland, on Russian intelligence, espionage, and they're also their special operations tradecraft. So I break it out by things like surveillance, dead drops and signal sites, or what we call sticks and bricks in CIA, or active measures, which is information warfare operations. That has its own
What does that
chapter.
mean, sticks and bricks?
Yeah, so sticks and bricks, for instance, is how we do street work and how the Russians do street work. They call it безличные связи, so impersonal communications. So the Russians have a tendency, strong tradition, if they're handling a really important agent in the West, in the UK or in the United States, one of the points I make in my book is don't be fooled by all this talk in the press in Europe. Oh, Russians don't use spy tradecraft anymore. They're running all their agents on Telegram. That's not so. The Russians aren't stupid, unfortunately. They know very well how to protect important penetrations of governments, and they do it very, very well. And I talk about in my book, the Hansen case, for instance. They ran it for 20 years. So this is using dead drops, or what you call in the UK, the British services call dead letter boxes, which is, a small package that you hide in the woods or in a quiet place. I detail, of course, Roland, I focus on the Russian intelligence tradecraft. I don't talk about how we do it, really. I don't want to give away our secrets. But the Russians have always used that when they're handling important agents, like penetrations of our government. I detail many in the book. And then there's other things that go into it, like surveillance or surveillance detection tradecraft. So that's all tradecraft, and it's very different than statecraft. I've often wondered, I look at my book, I'm glad Amazon ranks my book in several different areas. It's been a bestseller in the Russia-Soviet politics list. It was the top of that list for about 8 weeks. I wonder sometimes if they did it based on categorizing tradecraft as statecraft, which it's not. But I'm happy they ranked my book in Russian and Soviet politics. But my point is, they're fundamentally very different things. Statecraft, of course, foreign policy, how you carry out foreign policy. Tradecraft, in the intelligence sense, is everything that goes into recruiting, running, handling, and debriefing spies, penetrations of governments.
And you did a lot of that work.
I did, as CIA let me detail some in the book. We were very careful about how I detail some of the stories, but one of the surprises to me as a relatively new author, I had some chapters in books on the Ukraine war. I've done some writing. I have a column now. I write for the Cipher Brief in DC. I've had some other, had a piece in Foreign Policy magazine a couple weeks ago. But this is my first book as an author. So one of the surprises for me, Roland, was I tried to write a very good, thorough, well-cited academic study, in some ways academic, but then I wanted to mix in lived experience, and I wanted to target to a general reader. It's not targeted to professors and academics. It's targeted to try to get the word out on Russian intelligence. And as you said, it's an expose, show how they're trying to undermine democracy in the West. So one of the surprises for me is how much praise there's been, and positive acclaim, and very senior reviewers in the intelligence community, or spy historians like Keith Melton, who's one of the world's very best spy historians. He helped found the Spy Museum in DC. He endorsed my book officially a few weeks ago, and they like the stories. They say these stories are really unique. They're really, so for me, they were just my career. They were just what I did for better part of 3 decades. But I'm glad that readers enjoy them. I'm glad that they illustrate the points I'm trying to make about Russian corruption, about how their services are firmly dedicated to undermining democracy in the United States and the UK and elsewhere. So that's the lived experience that we put in the book. I'm glad people like it.
You briefly mentioned Rick Hansen, who was an FBI
Robert
agent.
Hansen, Robert Hansen, Rick Ames,
Robert Hansen, sorry.
Yep.
Sentenced in 2002, I believe.
2001, he was caught. Probably you're right. Around 2002, he would have been sentenced.
Yeah, so he went over to the Russian side, presumably motivated by greed and ego. There wasn't much ideology going around at the time. But you dealt with Russians who came over to the American side. Maybe you could talk a bit about their motivations.
Yeah, so Hansen's unique because he I make the point, I mentioned him earlier, Robert Hansen worked for 20 years for 3 different services, Roland. And I don't like to give compliments to our Russian adversaries, but one begrudging compliment I give in the book is, they know how to compartment cases. Hansen was not a double agent. Let's make sure we get terminology right. I do this in my book. I spent a lot of time on Russian and the translated terminology. And you didn't say that, but a lot of people do use a term, he's a double agent. No, he wasn't a double agent. He was a penetration of the FBI by the Russian government. If he was a double agent, he would have been presented by the Russians as an SVR officer pretending to work for the West. That's a double agent. That's pretend. That's fake. Hansen was legitimate penetration, and he did it for 20 years for the GRU at first, and then he stopped spying because his wife caught him, and he confessed to his priest, and Lord only knows why that priest didn't turn him in. I wish he had, because that could have saved the U.S. government a lot of betrayals and some lives that were lost, because, of course, Hansen got some spies killed, got Russians killed that he gave up. Then he spied for KGB, re-volunteered to the KGB, and then the SVR finally. Did it for 20 years. They did it very successfully. He cost the U.S. government hundreds of millions of dollars. He did incredible damage to our national security. So despite their corruption, despite their incompetence, their indifference at times, Roland, the Russians know how to spy too, and all they need is one success. And that's why they remain a very formidable adversary. They devote a huge amount of resources to finding spies like Hansen. And so that's where all the tradecraft comes into play too. As I detail in the book, as you know, hopefully your listeners will buy it and enjoy some of the stories. I detail how they ran Hansen, the type of tradecraft they used, in a level of detail that has never been given before, talking about their dead drops and their signal sites and how they used it. So that was Robert Hansen. And then Rick Ames, the other spy that you mentioned. Rick was a penetration of CIA, and he spied for about 9 years until he was caught. And again, the Russians compartmented him very, very well. So.
And what about the Russians come over to the US side? So the book has quite a few accounts of their motivations.
Yeah, I think the greatest motivation, those hero spies I touched on, I dedicate the book at the end, the epilogue's dedicated to hero spies. And that's not us. That's not me. That's not CIA or FBI case officers or FBI agents that work these cases. Although I've worked with a lot of great ones over the years, and I touch on some of those stories in the book. The hero spies are those Russians willing to risk their lives to help the United States and potentially give a new life to their families. So I believe that's the greatest motivation, Roland, along with ideology of another hero spy like Adolf Tolkachev, who I relate in the book. He was a scientist. There's the book by David Hoffman I also recommend called $1 Billion Spy. He saved the United States billions of dollars, literally, in defense research with the information he gave us. And he gave it to us because he believed that the Soviet Union was evil. It's inherently an evil system. To our parallels and references to Orwell, Tolkachev believed that the Soviet state as it was set up was corrupt, and it wasn't the idealistic dream of communism that everybody panned it as. Even Lenin himself, of course, talked about it, and I mentioned in my book, let's take advantage of those useful idiots out there in the West who believe in the communist ideal, because that's not really what the Soviet Union's about. What did Lenin say to Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the First Intelligence Committee? He said, we need the terror. I need you to institute as quickly as possible the terror against our people, because they need to be afraid of counter-revolution. So that's the legacy of the communist revolution, the Bolsheviks in Russia. And so hero spies like Tolkachev, he knew he would probably never leave Russia. He had a dream, but he knew it was probably never going to happen for him or his family. But his wife had been killed in the purges. His wife died in Stalin's purges. So Tolkachev believed, hey, this is a deeply corrupt, broken system and autocracy that I have to do my part as a scientist to undermine. And he risked his life, and ultimately he gave his life when he was compromised by Ames, Rick Ames, among others. He was also compromised by Ed Howard, most likely, according to open source, investigations, the history is written. And he was executed for it. So those are the hero spies.
You mentioned the moral character or lack thereof of the Soviet states and of Russia as the successor state. One thing that I notice in the political scene, the cultural scene, is a reluctance in some quarters to see Putin's Russia as the moral successor state to the Soviet Union. So, for example, if I think about the podcast world in the 2010s, there were all kinds of people who were very interested in the Soviet Union. They were very interested in hearing about Stalin's crimes. They're very interested in hearing about the Gulag Archipelago. And yet, when the Ukraine war kicked off, they didn't want to hear anything about supporting Ukraine. And they refused to see Putin's Russia as kind of like the moral successor state to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I think we've been naive in the West. I've had other journalists ask me, what did you all in CIA think of Putin? I mentioned the forward to my book, often written by former Deputy Director of Operations Mike Sulik, who's a legend within CIA. I'm honored he wrote the forward to my book, but he talks about in his forward, we Cold Warriors, we knew Putin for who he was. He is who we thought he was. He's a Chekist. He believes in that culture of Dzerzhinsky's terror. He proudly calls himself a Chekist. He talks about having read the novels of Yulian Semyonov that glorify the old illegals, the GRU and KGB illegals from World War II. And a lot of that's just mythology, Roland. It's carefully cultivated mythology. The NKVD, in fact, did a lot of damage to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union almost lost because of Stalin's purges. The thousands and tens of thousands of professional military officers that the NKVD executed in the purges. Well, let's forget about all that. Let's not talk about real history. Let's talk about the mythologized version where the Chekists, they were responsible for saving the Soviet Union. It's a bunch of nonsense. And but Putin cultivates it because it serves his very Orwellian mythology that the KGB elites and now the FSB elites, remember he was a former KGB officer, former FSB director, and all of his inner circle is siloviki. By the way, what about that term, Roland? Strongmen. The very term strongmen. What kind of a leader of any country with any semblance or pretense even of democracy or freedom in any way would call their inner circle of ruling elites the strongmen? But in Putin's Russia, that's a normal discourse. And so, yeah, that's the not just signs, but everything he's done in power in Russia for 26 years has been about going back. Look at what they just did within the past month. The FSB Academy now is renamed the Felix Dzerzhinsky Academy. This is a terrorist of Soviet and Russian history who was responsible during the Red Terror, right after the revolution, for killing hundreds of thousands of their own people.
This does seem a sign of the times. Yeah.
Yeah, so a sign of the times. It's now the Dzerzhinsky Academy again. And you'll see more of this. You're going to see more of the statues going up, like Dzerzhinsky's just went up at the FSB Academy. It's telling that the FSB never abandoned Lubyanka prison. Lubyanka prison, where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, were executed over the decades there. During the purges, were executed at Lubyanka and Lefortovo prisons. Lubyanka is still the headquarters where FSB Director Alexander Bortnikov reports to work every day in his limousine, coming from his golden dacha outside the city that was built for probably $1 billion, like all the Siloviki. That's why Navalny was killed, by the way. Navalny showed the corruption. He showed the ruling elite how well they live, while most of Russia, the soldiers that are dying at the front are dying from Siberia. They're dying from the regions, as the Russians say, from the provincia. So yeah, that carefully cultivated mythology of the USSR and how great it was, Roland, serves Putin and serves his elite. It serves the KGB, Siloviki. In point of fact, though, as we all know, the Russia that I visited in the early 90s was a disaster. The Soviet Union had collapsed under its own weight. It was a broken system. My wife grew up in the Soviet Union, waiting in lines. Her mom would put her in one line. Her sister goes and waits in the other line. Her mom waits in a third line. Every Soviet citizen knows those stories. The system was broke. It didn't work. And yet, under Putin, they're supposed to respect the KGB that kept it all. Yeah, the KGB kept that great system in the Soviet Union working. Yeah.
So
I'm glad they're remaking Animal Farm, Roland. We need it more than ever right now. We need the remake of the story more than ever.
Well, the history of filming Animal Farm has not always been a happy one. Anyway, I'll wait and see. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had this idea that Russia had abandoned ideology, and well, the world broadly accepted Putin as Russian president, and Russians broadly accepted him as well, in spite of his KGB background, or maybe in part because of his KGB background in Russia. So the KGB's heavily mythologized there as a heroic force in film, in novels. We could juxtapose that with the highly ambiguous portrayal of the CIA in American popular culture, Zero Dark 30, The Good Shepherd. So I guess with the apparent collapse of ideology, one of the questions that comes to mind is, how was Russia recruiting without ideology, and what is their pitch to a potential recruit, let's say, within Western or American intelligence?
Yeah, thank you, Roland. I talk about it too in the book, as you know. I talk about motivations, from my career and from my research. We look at cases. There have been ideological cases like the Rosenbergs, who spied, to help the Manhattan Project because they believed ideologically. But I mentioned in the book, I think a lot of those, the communist cause, nobody believes in anymore. Outside of Putin's carefully cultivated mythology, even within Russia, I don't think that resonates. I think most Russians know, like, wait a second, I'm going to follow Vladimir Vladimirovich, but we all know the USSR didn't work, So I think that, more broadly, I think that Putin has a credibility problem. The more that he refers to that, that past, everybody knows it didn't work. His security services are trying to keep the people safe. The repression is needed. I think it's starting to, you see these little hints, like the youth right now in Russia upset about Telegram. Why do they have to take away Telegram? Wait, we can't have even Telegram. We can't have any form of app where we communicate with one another. Well, for Putin, no, of course not. It's a threat, right? And he needs his security services to have even more repression, particularly in time of war. So I think that his greatest threat for Putin, of course, is democracy. You can't have functioning democracies. You can't have a functioning, thriving democracy that is Ukraine on their border. So none of that ideology resonates with Spies, Roland. Okay, nobody's going to really believe. You know what? I really want to live in the utopia that is Russia right now today, where Over 1,000 schools in Russia don't have indoor plumbing in the regions. That was reported on by The Economist a few weeks ago. Nobody believes in that. So what does it come down to for Russians? It's base ideologies. It's money. And then it's compromise. As I talk about in the book, it's compromising material operations is what the old KGB term. It means sexpionage, extorting businessmen, threatening them with physical violence. We'll arrest you, we'll throw you in jail, we'll torture you if you don't cooperate with us. And that's what they use. And you see that same coercion at play with hybrid war now, Roland, which I talk about a lot towards the end of the book, especially with Ukraine. You know, the sabotage happening in Europe, the attempted assassination of the Rheinmetall CEO in Germany. That's also extortion, coercion. You want to help Ukraine? We're going to kill your leaders of corporate companies in Europe. Even if it doesn't succeed, it serves their coercion that they know the word's gotten out there. Oh, geez, it's fair game now to kill business leaders. And so that's the way the Siloviki think. That's the way these thugs. This is a mafia culture that are the Russian intelligence services, Roland. So yeah, the only motivations they have left are base financial ones. Unfortunately, they find spies that are willing to betray their country for money. There always will be them, and that's why we need to be on top of our game in terms of counterintelligence in the West. And I believe we are. So
we're starting to see new books on the emergence of ideology in Russia. So Andrei Kolesnikov wrote The Closing of the Russian Minds, which outlines what he says is an emerging ideology, partly built around this, like the idea of the Third Rome, Russia's the last center of true Christianity, Russian Empire as a kind of necessity of expanding that idea, an embrace of traditional values, as put forth by Putin in his speeches. There's even a shared values visa where Westerners can go and live in Russia on the basis of shared values. What do you make of this new pitch to conservatism coming out of the Kremlin?
I'll tell you what, Russian intelligence officers I worked with, I hear their voice telling me right now, if they were sitting here, and I relayed a lot of stories debriefing them over the decades, Roland, if they were sitting right here, they would be laughing. They'd say that's a bunch of sentimental nonsense. That it's BS. They don't believe in it. The Russian government doesn't believe in it. It's carefully choreographed information warfare. It's a form of active measures. The same idea of, Alexander Dugin, the philosopher, the very pro-Russian nationalist, xenophobic, racist, quote, philosopher that he is. He's just a bigoted racist, is all he is. Spreads hatred against Ukraine, justifies their atrocities. So this is all just part of information warfare. I guarantee you, Putin doesn't believe it in himself. He doesn't. There's not an idealistic bone in his body. Putin practices realpolitik. Don't like what I'm doing? Stop me. 19th century Bismarck style, except Bismarck with a lot of atrocities like Putin's committed in Ukraine. So his challenge to the West is, you don't like what I'm doing? Do something about it. And so far, we haven't presented a credible deterrent. But all that nonsense about, the ideology that they're pushing, Roland, and there's a lot of this, you're right. It's all just carefully cultivated information warfare where they can take advantage, as Lenin said, take advantage of the useful idiots out there. Полезный дурак, a useful idiot, somebody that really believes in the ideology that even the Soviets didn't believe in, or Putin doesn't believe in today. And by the way, they take advantage of the Russian Orthodox Church too. And there's been a history of that for hundreds of years in Russia. The Tsars took advantage of the Orthodox Church. So did the Soviet Union. The only
relations
topic
of my last podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the only relationships the KGB had with Orthodox priests were to extort them, force them to collaborate. It's the same thing's happening today. The only Orthodox priests that get ahead, that do well in the system, including all the way up to the, patriarch, it's those that are spouting Putin's version of history, where Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist. And so they do well. They get state benefits. They get wealthy. It's all a form of the corruption, kleptocracy, unfortunately, imbued within. It's a shame because I respect the Russian Orthodox Church. Of course I do. My wife's Russian grandmother was Starovera, by the way. Russians know what that means. She was a hardcore Russian Orthodox believer in every way. But I don't know if that's possible even in Russia anymore, in a security state like it is, run by the FSB. There's just cynicism with regard to religion. So it's tragic.
Is the ideology landing at all in the West? Is this traditional values idea winning over the people you call useful idiots?
Yeah, this ridiculous belief that, again, my views are mine alone, but this hard right, far right, Orban, some of the elements in Germany, far right, and France, oh, we have things in common with the Russian far right too, don't we? No, you don't. You have nothing in common with them, except that the Russian far right wants you dominated and they want you subservient. And if it'd be up to them, you'd be a province of the Russian Federation. But I think they take advantage of it, Roland. I think that, again, in the West, we tend to be suckers for carefully choreographed Russian information warfare. Aktivnaya meropryatiya, as they call it. Chapter 9 in the book. And I hope, again, some of your listeners will consider the book.
Sean, I know you're running short on time, but
Thank you.
let's do NATO and alliances.
Sure.
So as you've been promoting the book, you've tried hard to keep things apolitical. You don't talk about the current administration, but you're very clear about your views on the importance of NATO, alliances, Ukraine's struggle to maintain its freedom. Russian sabotage operations are on the increase in Europe. Pentagon is reducing U.S. troop numbers in Europe. Ukraine, for its part, is an emerging power with know-how to offer its allies. How do you see the Western alliance structure now?
Thank you. You just stated a lot of bullets I've been hitting on, Roland. Thank you for paying attention. I wrote a column for the Cipher Brief back in December. I called it Echoes of 1940. Why America can learn so much from Ukraine. That Ukraine needs us, but we need Ukraine. Why we should be learning from the drone war. And we didn't. And then we're in Iran right now, and we desperately need that know-how and that technology. So the Ukrainians aren't just coming to us empty-handed. They're coming with a wealth of knowledge against our adversaries about drone war, about hybrid war, about what the Russians have done to them and continue to do in that war. And NATO's next, Roland. This is not a war just in a vacuum. This was not one step. This is Putin's greatest belief that he articulated as part of his justification for the war. Remember, Putin said, the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. I've always marveled at that statement. What an asinine statement. I'm sorry, for a leader of a giant country, a great state like Russia should be, to say that. The Russians and the Soviets lost 25 million of their people in World War II. They suffered like no other ally, and they were an ally of ours. They lost millions during the Red Terror. They lost countless millions during World War I with the Tsar's irresponsible policies and military disasters. But for Putin, the greatest disaster is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why? Because he was invested in that system. Again, the elitist KGB veterans that surround him, that rule Russia right now and want to continue to rule, that's their narrative, Roland. So I believe strongly that NATO is in the fight in Ukraine, and we have to be. We can't bow out of this one. A country like the United States that's celebrating 250 years of our freedom, we've always stood for freedom. We've always stood for those that are fighting against tyranny, and the Ukrainians are fighting like no one else today. Nowhere is that contrast more stark, those fighting for freedom and those trying to oppress. So I believe in NATO. I believe in the 80 years of the alliance. As the king said on his recent visit to the United States, let's not forget, we've had difficulties in the alliance before. There was the Suez crisis in, 53? So NATO's going to go through difficulties, but we are the envy of Russia and China, by the way. We have alliances that matter. We have allies like the United Kingdom, Germany, France, NATO, all of those countries, Denmark, that have stood by us in time of war. So I believe in the alliance. I believe it's always going to stand. I believe it's the envy of our adversaries who don't have anything like it. So thanks for giving me a chance to say what I believe one more time.
Thanks very much, Sean. So the book is Tradecraft, Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. You can find Sean's writing in the Cipher Brief, Foreign Policy, U.S. Naval Institute website. He's on X and Instagram. To support the Orwellians, you can subscribe to the Orwellian Substack at theorwellians.substack.com or donate via the Stripe link in the show notes. I'm also on Instagram and X. You can read my long-form articles in New Lines magazine. My book, Godless Utopia, Soviet Anti-Religious Propaganda, is getting harder to find, but it looks like the Amazon US site still has some copies. Thanks very much, Sean.
Thank you, Roland. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about things we're both passionate about. Thank you for your work drawing attention to Russia, their malign policies. You've had some great guests on. Many of them I admire, so I was glad to come on as well. The book's available in paperback in the UK and across Europe, and Amazon booksellers like Waterstones in the UK and around the world. So pick it up, please. I think you'll enjoy it. And thanks for the opportunity, Roland.
Thanks very much, Sean.
Thanks.
Bye now.